I am an activist and I've been involved in the climate movement for over a decade now. Basically I'm just going to talk about how actually the climate movement is quite diverse. It's just been continuously whitewashed, and the processes through which this movement has been whitewashed, and how it's very much done by the activists themselves. So I want to start off with like a bit of a personal story. There was a camp in 2013 called at Reclaim the Power, and it was an anti-fracking camp. And on the first day, I was only there for 3 days. On the first day, the only black person who came to the camp was arrested for walking down the street. Later on that evening, I was accosted by 2 white men who came up to me and asked me, why is it that every single time we have a climate activism camp, the black people who this is affecting more don't come along? I won't add any more. It's very clear why that always happened. Needless to say, she was not, the activist here was not arrested, but the black man who was walking down the street was. In 2015, there was a mass climate demo called the People's Climate March for Justice and Jobs. The whole process actually had a block in it, which was in London, across lots of different groups and communities, lots of different activist groups who got together to try and present something called what they called Wretched of the Earth block after Fanon's book. After spending months of negotiating with the actual organisers of the march, which included places like groups like Greenpeace, the VARs, the unions, etc., they were promised that they'd be put at the front of the march because obviously they were the front line, the community at the front lines of climate change. On the actual day when they turned up, they were actually removed from that and were replaced by people dressed as animals. They were told that they weren't performing their forms of indigeneity and cultural diversity enough because they hadn't been wearing colourful dresses and like what they termed as ethnic sort of clothing, and therefore didn't look visually appealing. The organisers of the march also called the police on them several times when they decided to do some activism on the side. And there's an excellent article by the actual organisers, which there's a link to below, but there's a really good quote from the actual article, which says, "The climate movement is not white, but it is being whitewashed. Indigenous rights and racial justice are not a distraction, they are the heart of climate justice. There is no more time for your dirty games, the clock is ticking." And more recently, in 2018, the UK No Tar Sands Network, which has been campaigning for well over a decade with First Nations groups to stop tar sands in Canada, were subjected to a sort of erasure by Greenpeace UK and Greenpeace Canada, who decided to who held a demonstration outside when Justin Trudeau was sort of visiting, and their demonstration claimed that suddenly no tar sands campaigning had gone international, erasing well over a decade of work by UK activists and First Nations groups who had been directly doing this work, and Greenpeace did nothing about it. The UK tar sands network shut down, and they decided to only organise within the UK tar sands network, which is based across Europe as well. Because of this action, Greenpeace did not apologise. This moves on to more recent things. A lot of you may know about Extinction Rebellion. It's got lots of different branches across the UK, but Extinction Rebellion itself continues this movement of whitewashing. Firstly, their actual name, Extinction, kind of pushes this message that the people on that climate change is affecting everyone equally, that it's a mass extinction event that isn't actually, it's something that's completely new. It's like, it's never happened before. What we know from history and from like various forms of research, that people who have faced extinction have been indigenous communities. They have been black and brown bodies as well, who've had to experience extinction from colonization as well. We also know that the actual movements of colonialism within the US have completely obliterated have created such environmental disasters that it's not just the fact that we are producing too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that's creating climate change, but it's actually the erasure of, the removal and sort of, what is it called, land clearing of the Americas, and specifically when colonialism was happening back then, that has created the roots of what we now know as global warming. The other problems with Extinction Rebellion themselves is that they have continually failed to work with diverse communities. They've created a culture of arrest fetishism, and in a recent article with The Guardian, I believe the two organisers said that basically it was okay for them to just get arrested, and then they go on demos, they get arrested, they go and read a book in prison, and they come home and they have a cup of tea. And that does not work for people of colour at all, considering the relationship that people of colour have with the police and how they're treated, etc. It's also, their movement has continuously said that they are the only people acting on climate change, erasing the fact that most movements that came out of things like Climate Camp, which have then been going through a process of decolonisation, have moved on to realising that the struggles against climate change are not climate change alone. They are actually intersected with lots of different struggles, like for example, Stanza 15, which came out of very much of the climate change movement, which has been realises the connections between deportation, the hostile environment, and climate change as a culture and narrative. So this idea that somehow climate change is not being tackled within the activist movement, like there's not enough activists fighting for climate change, is definitely erasing the fact that the movement has gone intersectional, at least down south in London. In Scotland, the climate change movement remains white and white-centred. There are not, the conversations around decolonisation are barely centred as far as I've experienced in the movement. There is something that came out which is the Climate Challenge Fund offered by the government, but that was sort of more targeted at like making sure ethnic minorities were doing their equal bit in reducing their carbon emissions rather than discussing the rooted problems within like climate colonialism at all. And I know from personal experience also that several NGOs in Scotland, environmental organisations specifically, have no interest in engaging in minority groups. One, because they think that minority groups aren't effective in creating change, and two, that they believe that there's not enough of people of colour to actually care about it at all, and that white people generally just don't care about people of colour, so what's the point in doing that? So there's definitely work in Scotland that needs to be done in connecting those struggles better. But there are movements which are changing. Despite all my negativity, there are movements that are changing. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a demonstration at the British Museum in London, organised by a group of activists called BP or Not BP, which basically have been using performance art as a way of campaigning against this oil companies sponsoring different forms of art exhibits or any form of art or like sort of historical exhibits in this case. And it was a protest which was against against an exhibit called I Am Usher. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. Which is an exhibit about the Iraq War that was Iraq's history, which was sponsored by BP when in 2003, before the Iraq War was happening, BP was pressuring the UK government to actually say, hey, there's loads of oil there, we should definitely be attacking Iraq. And this was organised with a group of Iraqi people, Iraqi diaspora, trying to reclaim the idea that BP should not be whitewashing their crimes through things like art sponsorship. And that's a quote from one of the activists. There was also an equal exhibit that was also hosted by them just nearby, which I had the opportunity to visit, which is called IMBP. So there also are examples of other intersectional struggles. I haven't mentioned all of them, and there's so much more I could talk about, but 6 minutes is a really short amount of time. So I spoke about the Stanford 15, and there's also other groups. So after the demo in 2015, there was something called Retro the Edge that then sort of fizzled out a bit, but did become Decolonizing Environmentalism, which is a group which kind of does a lot of discussions and training and sort of work on challenging the whiteness of the climate change movement. There's also Gentle Radical in Cardiff, which is more of a decolonizing group. And some of the NGOs across, well, in London at least, sorry, a lot of London-centered stuff, but it is where a lot of these changes are happening, are being led by minority ethnic folks, changing the actions are kind of organised and where funding is going and what kind of work is being done. However, the big NGOs that we know of, like Oxfam, Greenpeace, etc., still continue to perform sort of acts of whiteness by erasing any form of POC. And that's my whole thing.